Hi everyone. You might be wondering why I have a knife and fork with me today. It's because we're going to do a book tasting. You know, we're stuck at home right now and you might feel like there's not a lot to do, but I think this is a good time to get into a good book. And I was thinking about being stuck at home a lot and thinking about one of my favorite authors from when I was a child, Laura Ingalls Wilder. She wrote about her childhood, living out on the prairies out west in our country, and of the hardships, but also about how her family came together and overcame so much. And one of my favorite books that she wrote was called The Long Winter. I don't have an actual copy of it. I'll be reading on my Kindle device. I was actually able to get this book for 99 cents in a Kindle version, which you could get for if you have a Kindle or if you have probably any kind of a tablet or want to read it on your computer. So it's really inexpensive. And it tells the story of Laura and her family. She was about 13, 14 years old at the time, and how they lived through this very long winter where they had blizzard after blizzard starting in October, and it went through April. And it tells of their tenacity and their willingness to work together and to help each other and their faith. And it just really, the book really inspires me. And I just finished reading it over this past weekend. So I wanted to share it with you and do a little book tasting with you. That's why I have my knife and fork here. And I'm going to be reading chapter 4 to you. Just to give you that little taste. And I hope that you find it for yourself. And I'd also like you to share the books that you're reading right now. If you found something really, really interesting to read, please put it in the comments below so that we can all get some ideas of what we can be doing during this time that we are stuck inside. All right, so the book's coming up in a second. Okay, everyone, are you ready to taste? This is a selection from chapter 5 from The Long Winter by Laura Ingalls Wilder. In this section of the story, they've had a blizzard, and they look out the window and see some cattle, some stray cattle are by their haystacks, and they need those haystacks to feed their own cattle and their own horses. So they're a little concerned that these cattle that they don't know might be getting into them. I never knew a winter to set in so early, Pa admitted, but I don't like the feeling of things. What things, Charles? Ma wanted to say. Pa couldn't say exactly. He said, there's some stray cattle by the haystacks. Are they tearing down the hay? Ma asked quickly. No, said Pa. Then what of it, if they aren't doing any harm? Ma said. I guess they're tired out by the storm, said Pa. They took shelter there by the haystacks. I thought I'd let them rest and eat a little before I drove them off. I can't afford to let them tear down the stacks, but they could eat a little without doing any harm. But they aren't eating. What's wrong then? Ma said. Nothing, Pa said. They're just standing there. That's nothing to upset a body, said Ma. No, Pa said. He drank his tea. Well, I might as well go and drive them off. He put on his coat and cap and mittens again and went out. After a moment, Ma said, you might as well go with him, Laura. He may need some help to drive them away from the hay. Quickly, Laura put Ma's shawl over her head and pinned it snugly under her chin with the shawl pin. The woolen folds covered her from head to foot. Even her hands were under the shawl. Only her face was out. Outdoors, the sun glitter hurt her eyes. She breathed a deep breath of the tingling cold and squinted her eyes to look around her. The sky was hugely blue and all the land was blowing white. The straight, strong wind did not lift the snow, but drove it scudding across the prairie. The cold stung Laura's cheeks. It burned in her nose and tingled in her chest and came out in steam on the air. She held a fold of the shawl across her mouth and her breath made frost on it. When she passed the corner of the stable, she saw Pa going ahead of her and she saw the cattle. She stood and stared. The cattle were standing in the sunshine and shadow by the haystacks, red and brown and spotted cattle and one thin black one. They stood perfectly still, every head bowed down to the ground. The hairy red necks and brown necks all stretched down from bony, gaunt shoulders to monstrous, swollen white heads. "Pa," Laura screamed. Pa motioned to her to stay where she was. He was on, trudging through the low-flying snow toward those creatures. They didn't seem like real cattle. They stood so still. In the whole herd, there was not the least movement. Only their breathing sucked their hairy sides in between their rib bones and pushed them out again. Their hip bones and their shoulder bones stood up sharply. Their legs were braced out, stiff and still. And where their heads should be, swollen white lumps seemed fast to the ground under the blowing snow. On Laura's head, the hair prickled up and a horror went down her backbone. Tears from the sun and the wind swelled in her staring eyes and ran cold on her cheeks. Pa went on slowly against the wind. He walked up to the herd. Not one of the cattle moved. For a moment, Pa stood looking. Then he stooped and quickly did something. Laura heard a bellow, and a red steer's back humped and jumped. The red steer ran staggering and bawling. It had an ordinary head with eyes and nose and an open mouth, bawling out steam in the wind. Another one bellowed and ran a short, staggering run, then another. Pa was doing the same thing to them all, one by one. Their bawling rose up to the cold sky. At last, they all drifted away together. They went silently now in the knee-deep spray of blowing snow. Pa waved to Laura to go back to the shanty while he inspected the haystacks. "Whatever kept you so long, Laura?" Ma asked. "Did the cattle get into the haystacks?" "No, Ma," she answered. I guess their heads were frozen to the ground." "That can't be," Ma exclaimed. "It must be one of Laura's queer notions," Mary said, busily knitting in her chair by the stove. "How could cattle's heads freeze to the ground, Laura? It's really worrying the way you talk sometimes." "Well, ask Pa then," Laura said shortly. She was not able to tell Ma and Mary what she felt. She felt that somehow, in the wild night and storm, the stillness that was underneath all sounds on the prairie had seized the cattle. When Pa came in, Ma asked him, "What was wrong with the cattle, Charles?" "Their heads were frozen over with ice and snow," Pa said. "Their breath froze over their eyes and their noses till they couldn't see nor breathe." Laura stopped sweeping. "Pa, their own breath smothering them," she said in horror. Pa understood how she felt. He said, "They're all right now, Laura. I broke the ice off their heads. They're breathing now, and I guess they'll make it to shelter somewhere." Carrie and Mary were wide-eyed, and even Ma looked horrified. She said briskly, "Get your sweeping done, Laura. And Charles, for pity's sakes, why don't you take off your wraps and warm yourself?" And I'm going to stop right there. If you want to find out what happens, please go find The Long Winter by Laura Ingalls Wilder. I loved reading this book. I loved reading it as a kid. I loved reading it as an adult, and I think you'd really enjoy it. Have a great day and stay safe.